G'day, welcome to the Digger History Podcast. I'm your host, Keith Robertson. If you are Australian, you have probably heard of the Rats of Tobruk, the nickname given to the besieged defenders of the small town of Tobruk in 1941. The siege began on the 10th of April 1941, which is, as of the date that I'm recording this episode, 85 years ago to the day. Around 14,000 Australian troops from the 9th Division, as well as British artillery troops, Indian troops, of roughly the same number, defended a besieged small town on the Libyan coast called Tobruk against combined German and Italian forces. The town was surrounded on all three sides, with only the port of Tobruk kind of serving as the lifeline, the only way that the defenders could get supplies. The Australian troops were only supposed to be there for 8 weeks, but they ended up staying. Most of them stayed until August that year. Some of them stayed until December when the siege was officially lifted. So in this episode, I want to talk a bit about why Australian troops were in Tobruk in the first place. What was the point? What was the strategic importance of this? What was really a little town, and what the Australians actually achieved in Tobruk. Now, as with all my podcast episodes, this is not going to be like an in-depth battle by battle, drill down deeply on exactly what happened. More of a broad overview of the whole the whole theatre. So before we start in Tobruk, I want to rewind a little bit. I'm going to go back to the start of World War II, just to give a bit of a few key points, and key moments that will help explain what Australia was actually doing in Libya and in Tobruk in the first place. So let's go back to the 1st of September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France gave Germany the ultimatum to withdraw from Poland. They gave them a 3-day ultimatum, and when Germany hadn't withdrawn on the 3rd of September, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And shortly after, on the same day, Australia also declared war on Germany. Now I'm going to skip ahead to the next date that's relevant to this story, and that's the 10th of June 1941, when Italy joined the war by declaring war on Britain and France, and therefore Australia as well. Now, Italy had interests in North Africa, specifically in Libya. So with the Italians occupying Libya, this created a bit of a concern for the British, because bordering Libya to its east is Egypt, and Egypt, British had interest in Egypt, in particular the Suez Canal, which was and still is a vital shipping lane, and they had reason to be concerned because the Italians did do some raids into Egypt. Now let's backpedal a little bit and have a bit of a look at the map of the region. So it's a bit hard to describe a map over audio, but if you can imagine, like you've got the top half of Africa, and you've got Libya to the east, you've got Egypt, and then to the North Africa, basically what separates North Africa and the European continent is the Mediterranean. So on the other side of the Mediterranean, you've got Italy, you've got Greece, you've got Crete, and this whole theatre is going to, well, shortly in this timeline is going to become a big theatre of the war. So if you're sailing east through the Mediterranean, the only way kind of out of the Mediterranean is the Suez Canal, which is a canal that's um, part of Egypt, part of Egypt's territory, and this became like a major kind of conflict point in the First World War as well, but being a very important shipping channel, whoever whoever controlled the Suez Canal um, controlled, the shipping. Basically, it was supplies depended on the Suez Canal. So same as back in World War One, where defence of the Suez was vital. Same as in World War Two. So for the British interest in Egypt, it was like a major concern having Italians, who are now the enemy, on their border, um, raiding into Egypt. Tobruk was also of great strategic importance because it was a deep sea port, and in fact the only deep sea port between Tripoli, the capital of Libya, and Alexandria in Egypt. So it was kind of a strategic um, port for supplying troops. So if you imagine if you've got a land campaign, the further you advance, the longer your supply lines become. So if you're in Tripoli, which is several hundred kilometers to the west of Tobruk, and you're trying to get to Egypt, the further you advance, the more stretched your supply lines become. So if you're trying to resupply your troops with food, water, ammunition, fuel, more troops, spare parts, that that all has to happen by road unless you can find a port along the way. And Tobruk was that vital port. Without that port, your supply lines were just too long to maintain a push into Egypt. So in about September 1940, the Italians started um, doing raids and actually advancing into Egypt from Libya. And in about December, the British forces started to push back a bit. Firstly, um, with a few raids, and then that kind of like became bigger and actually became what's known as Operation Compass. Now I say British, but there were also Australians there. There were also Indian troops there. Um, and the reason the Australians were there was um, much like back in World War One. The AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, formed in Australia, but went over to the Middle East to do their training. So the big training camps in Egypt and Palestine, and the Australians over their training. The intention initially wasn't for them to fight in North Africa, but to train there, to be like a big training ground there. But as this North Africa campaign started to build up, then the Australians were utilised as troops there in that campaign. So much as like the case in World War One, where the Australians were over there in Egypt, training at first when the war kind of came to that area, the Australians were in the vicinity, and so became utilised in that campaign. So anyway, Operation Compass, I'm not going to go too much into that because it's kind of like another story in itself. This podcast is about the Siege of Tobruk. Um, so I just want to point out a few relevant points building up to it without really going into depth, because each of these things could be another podcast in itself. So basically, over the next few months, the British, Australians, Indians, they they pushed back the Italians from out of Egypt, and they kept pushing them back across Libya. The town of Bardia was captured, and once again, that could be a separate podcast in itself. The Battle of Bardia, um, but yeah, Bardia was between or is between the border with Egypt and Tobruk. So first Bardia was captured, and then Tobruk was captured, and then Benghazi. The Allied troops, the British troops, pushed further and went to Benghazi. And from here, the offensive kind of stopped, and the British kind of like um, remained in place, didn't push any further towards Tripoli, but they kind of like held held the line, and reduced their troop numbers. They redeployed troops elsewhere to Greece and to Crete. So the numbers of British and Australian and Indian troops um, was lower. They decreased the troop size, thinking that they had the Italians under control. The commanders were pretty confident the Italians weren't going to push back and try to take back Libya and push back into Egypt. The Germans, however, had other plans. They landed at Tripoli under the command of General Erwin Rommel, or aka the Desert Fox. Now Rommel was a tank commander, and he was used to blitzkrieg tactics of pushing through Europe at the start of the war. So he he was a very formidable commander, and and Germans and Italians started pushing back across eastwards across the desert. So Benghazi, which had been taken by British and Australian troops back in February, was retaken by the Germans and Italians on the 6th of April 1941. In fact, Benghazi actually changed hands 5 times throughout the course of World War II. So the push eastward was very rapid, using tanks, using the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, and infantry, tactics that have been like tried and tested in the European theatre. They were being used again in the desert theatre. So the Allies were on the back foot. They were withdrawing under these German and Italian forces, and as I said, by 6th of April, Benghazi had been taken back. It was back in German and Italian hands, and by the 10th of April, the Germans and the Italians, the Axis, forces, I'll call them from now on, so I don't have to keep saying German and Italian, were outside of Tobruk, and they kind of had Tobruk surrounded, like on all three sides. So Tobruk was this little port town. Um, it was kind of just a port and kind of like nothing really there except for the port, and they're surrounded on all sides. Um, the lines between Tobruk and and Egypt, and there's no way from Tobruk to Egypt across land that had been cut by the Germans. Uh, they were, yeah, the Australians, the British, the Allies were surrounded. And look, the Australian Ninth Division were the majority of the troops that were there. They made up about half of the troops, around 14,000. But they're also British artillery. They're also Indian troops. They're also like a kind of a people like troops that just kind of like were coming back in like units, like all kind of flowing into Tobruk, um, bits and pieces of units, and that didn't really had been cut off from their other units, and they're all kind of merging on Tobruk. And the commander of the Australian Ninth Division, General Leslie Morshead, he was a veteran of Gallipoli and the Western Front back in World War One. He was in charge of the Australian Ninth Division, but then he also became the commander of the garrison of Tobruk. So he also inherited the command of like all the British and Indian units that were formed the garrison of Tobruk. And this is where Tobruk became really strategically important, because in order for the Germans to advance any further into Egypt, they needed that deep water harbour of Tobruk, because their supply lines were just getting too long. So they had to take Tobruk. So they surrounded Tobruk, hoping to, like, siege the town, and for the besieged troops to either withdraw or to like or for the Axis to basically overrun the Allies. Um, but it didn't quite work out to plan. Um, and we hear stories, like being Australian, we hear the stories about how the Rats of Tobruk were the first troops to turn back German panzers and to defeat their blitzkrieg tactics, which is, essentially true, but there were also other factors that came into play. So if you think like the Germans and Italians, they weren't really cooperating together all that well. Um, the, so Tobruk had a lot of like underground um, infrastructure, fortresses, and tunnels and things built around. So when you looked at Tobruk from across the desert, it looked like nothing, but in fact there was a lot of fortifications dug in. Um, and the Italians didn't give the Germans any maps of this, so the Germans were just kind of like going into it not knowing what was going on. So there was a lot of poor communication between the Germans and Italians there. But it is true that the defenders of Tobruk actually thwarted the blitzkrieg tactics, the tactics that had given the Germans victory all through Europe. So the usual tactics were for the the tanks to come in. The tanks would go in, followed by the infantry. The tanks would just like blast their way through, and and then the infantry would kind of like, you know, get on the ground, like mop up everything else. And it was quite fast. Blitzkrieg means like lightning war, so it happened quite fast. And this happened at the start of the war all throughout Europe. So um, and it kind of worked pushing back the Allies from Benghazi as well. But the difference here is so the dug-in Allied troops actually allowed the tanks to come through. So instead of like trying to fight the tanks head on as they came through, they actually allowed the, the tanks to come through the line, and then they focused on the infantry. So they engaged the infantry that was behind the tanks, um, and then kind of separated that those forces, so that the um, the tanks and the infantry were kind of codependent on each other because the infantry needed the tanks to like spearhead the assault, but the tanks also needed the infantry to protect them from anti-tank weapons. So without the infantry, the tanks were kind of a bit vulnerable there. So the tactics of allowing the tanks to come to the line and then engaging with the infantry, and then as the tanks came through, others would engage the tanks, and this actually stopped the blitzkrieg tactics. There's also speculation that the Germans may have thought that the Allies were going to evacuate Tobruk as they did in Dunkirk, but General Morshead actually specifically said there will be no Dunkirk here, so he actually gave specific instructions to hold Tobruk. Now, the term Rats of Tobruk is all familiar with, or if you're Australian, you would no doubt be familiar with. It kind of started off as German propaganda. So German propaganda, um, they were on the radio. So the way propaganda was used is they have radio stations that the enemy was listening to, and these radio announcers would try to dishearten the enemy. A famous one was called Lord Bohor, a famous German propagandist, but there were others as well. And they told they were telling the defenders of Tobruk they were like rats, they were trapped like rats. So Aussies being Aussies kind of took that as a badge of honor and called themselves the Rats of Tobruk. Now, over the next few months, there was a few attempts by the Allies to break the siege. Um, so, coming out from Egypt, capturing a few strategic locations on the Egyptian and Libyan border, and pushing forward from then, trying to break the siege on Tobruk. And there was one in there was an attempt in May um, to to break the siege on Tobruk, another attempt in June, and then again in November. And there was one in November that eventually got through and broke the siege. So on the 10th of December 1941, the siege was broken. So that final attempt the successful attempt to break through and break the siege of Tobruk, Operation Crusader, started the 21st of November, and December was when the siege was lifted. Um, Between the 7th and the 10th of December, um, the siege was broken. On the 10th of December, the last Australian unit was evacuated. Um, after the siege was lifted, um, most of the Australians were actually replaced in about September, October that year, but the second 13th Battalion actually remained for the for the duration until the siege was lifted and was evacuated on the 10th of December. So the troops were only supposed to stay there for 8 weeks before being relieved, but most of them were there for 6 months, and some of them actually stayed for 8 months before they were actually relieved. So there were also kind of two um kind of like separate battlegrounds here. There was the land war where the land forces were fighting like Germans and Italians on all sides, all three sides. And then there was the sea war because the only way in and out, the only way to resupply troops um, was by sea, was by the port of Tobruk. So they needed a constant wave of ships coming in, supplying this port, and it was quite dangerous. Like the Royal Navy, Royal Australian Navy, um, they were they were constantly like under attack from the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, um, and several ships were sunk. So you can imagine like you're kind of stuck in this little port town with the enemy surrounding you by land on all sides, and there's ships trying to get supplies to you, trying to get you food, fuel, ammunition, water, all coming in by sea. But these ships that are trying to bring you in supplies are running a gauntlet of being bombed by enemy aircraft. So as I said, 10th of December, the siege was lifted. The last of the Australian troops were relieved, were evacuated from Tobruk, but that was by no means the end of their contribution to World War II, because by that stage the Japanese had entered the war, and a whole new theatre of war was about to begin, or had begun, and many of these troops would later go on to fight in the Pacific Islands in New Guinea against the Japanese. The desert campaign in North Africa would continue, and in fact in 1942, Tobruk was actually taken by the Germans, but by that stage of the war, it didn't quite have the strategic importance that it did in 1941. So during the siege of Tobruk, the Australian casualties from the Ninth Division, um, there were 750 killed, nearly 2,000 were wounded, and 600 odd Australians were taken prisoner. The term Rats of Tobruk has become like iconic in Australia. It's a big part of our history. It's amazing how like the what started off as an insult, as a bit of propaganda, was taken on as a badge of honour. So I hope you enjoyed that little I guess overview on the siege of Tobruk, and how the Rats of Tobruk got their name, and what actually happened. And like I said, there's a lot of other battles around that area that are deserving of their own episode. Um, the Battle of Bardia, for example, it is a podcast in its own. The ships that brought the supplies to Tobruk during the siege, a lot of ships were sunk, a lot of sailors were killed. Um, there's a lot of other stories deserving of their own podcast, um, their own standalone podcast episode. So that's just kind of a brief overview of what was happening in Tobruk. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. I hope you got something out of it. Please please share with with people that you think might enjoy it. Um, if you haven't already subscribed to my podcast, please do so. Um, if you've got anything that you want me to talk about, um, an episode on a particular topic, reach out, put something in the comments, reach out to me because I actually get a lot from this myself. There might be some topics I don't know much about, and then I research them and find out a lot of things myself. So I enjoy doing the research for these episodes. Um, yeah, so sing out, give me a yell if you have any particular topic you want me to talk about. So once again, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.